Welcome everybody to session 101 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. The author and works that we're going to be looking at this time are Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. We've got 4 volumes of it here, books 9 through 12 in the series that I'll tell you a bit about very quickly in just a minute. If you're wondering, well, what is this? This is a monthly series that we are now in the 11th year of doing. It's called Worlds of Speculative Fiction, so that already gives you some idea about what we're doing. We're looking at speculative fiction, so everything from fantasy to alternate history to horror, sci-fi, apocalyptic, and everything in between. And we focus on particular authors and particular series of stories or novels that share a common universe, a narrative universe that gets developed in the process. So in this case, we're looking at, you could call it supernatural fiction, detective fiction. Some people like to call it urban fantasy because it's centered around the city of Chicago. And there's a lot of exploration of Chicago, but also of alternate realms as well, like the land of fairy, the Never Never, or all sorts of other places that are quite interesting to explore. And there's other locations, for example, the lair of the White Council in Edinburgh. We're going to go down to South America in Changes and a number of other places as well. And what we do is we look for the world building, what the author, him or herself, has to say about their series, the development, and we look for particular interesting philosophical themes that we can explore. Sometimes we get a lot into narrative in terms of plot, character, all of those sorts of developments as well. So we have 4 books here. Book 9 is White Knight. Book 10 is Small Favors. Book 11, Turncoat, and then finally the pretty monumental Book 12, Changes, which really is perfectly titled because there are some major significant changes that are happening in the grand narrative arc as we're going to talk about. So what we're going to do, we've already covered Butcher's biography in previous sessions. We don't need to go into that. We're going to jump right into talking about the narrative universe and what is continuing to be added to it, to be re-explored in it. And then we'll jump into all sorts of other really interesting aspects that are revealed through these works. I am going to say one thing sort of on a personal note before we get going proper with this. So I really enjoy this series, and I also have a family member who really enjoys it as well. He is currently 1 book ahead of me. I actually like these so much that I'm going to the library later today to get the book that immediately follows Changes, Ghost Story, and I'll tell you why in just a bit. So I do also have to mention there's going to be spoilers in this, so if you don't like spoilers, maybe you want to stop right now. We're going to talk about some plot points and key matters that come up that really change the narrative universe that Dresden is involved in. Now, I mentioned a family member. It's my dad. He is also a huge fan of speculative fiction. We talk about once a week and geek out together. And we've been talking a lot in the last month about these particular books. He had to warn me, I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen in Changes because I'll just say it's big. And yes, indeed, it is big. So I'm going to be launching into the next book shortly. Won't be talking about it here until probably next year, considerably far down the line. We've got other authors to get to, but I will say this is a great series, and I'm very happy to be about halfway through what Butcher projects is going to be the total narrative arc. So that's enough out of me about that. Let's talk about the world of supernatural Chicago. Examining the ongoing world building is something that's particularly rich when it comes to the Dresden files. Each book tells us a little bit more about the universe that Harry Dresden is carrying his work out in. And you can say that, at least in general, half of the action is happening within the city of Chicago, where Harry Dresden has his office, well, until it gets blown up, his apartment, again, until it gets burned down, and most of the action and commerce that he's engaged in. However, Chicago is itself connected up with a number of other things. There are ways to connect one point in Chicago with a place in the realm of fairy, the Never Never, and using that travel a significant distance, as we're going to see happening, for example, in Turncoat, also in Changes as well, and a number of other things like that. Now, Chicago itself, as we're going to read, is a place where there's a lot of magical energies coming together. I just want to read you one passage from White Knight. Chicago is an old city, at least by American standards. It's been standing in one form or another since the French and Indian Wars, before the United States even existed. Being as Chicago is basically one giant swamp from a strictly geographic point of view, buildings tended to slowly settle into the earth over years and years. The old wooden streets did the same, and new streets had to be built to top them in successive layers. Wherever the ground isn't slow-motion mud, there's solid rock. Tunnels and cave systems riddle the area. The Manhattan Project had been housed briefly in such tunnels before it got relocated to the middle of nowhere. Someone in the government had shown unaccountably good judgment in considering the notion that developing a nuclear weapon smack in the middle of America's second largest city at the time qualified as a bad idea. All that had left behind an enormous labyrinth of passages, caves, half-collapsed old buildings, and crumbling tunnels, seemingly ready to come thundering down at any moment. It was dark. Human beings rarely went there, and as a result, Undertown had become a home, shelter, and hiding place to all kinds of nasty things no mortal, not even a wizard, had ever seen. Some of these things, in turn, had expanded some of the tunnels and caves, establishing jealously protected territories that never saw the face of the sun, never heard the whisper of the wind. It's dark, close, cold, and intensely creepy down there. The fact that it's inhabited by things that had no love for mankind and potential radioactivity to boot didn't do much to boost its tourism industry. So why is Harry talking about that? Because he's got to go down there chasing this person that he calls Gray Cloak to try to catch him. And as it's going to turn out, there's actually a facsimile, a model of Chicago called Little Chicago in Harry's sub-basement that he can use to scry things across the city, but not this part of it, right? In part because you have to have enough stuff from that area. So Chicago is going to be a really important locus. As we're going to find out, most human beings in the Chicagoland area are not aware of the, let's call it, occult significance and power running through the place. I do want to bring up something kind of interesting about it that comes up in Turncoat early on. So Harry is, leaving his brother's Thomas place, and he feels himself being pursued, so he's going to use his wizard's sight, which reveals things as they genuinely are. So we read, a wizard's sight, his ability to perceive the world around him in a vastly broadened spectrum of interacting forces, is a dangerous gift. Whether it's called spirit vision or inner sight or the third eye, it lets you perceive things you'd otherwise never be able to interact with. It shows you the world the way it really is. Matter all intertwined with a universe of energy, of magic. The sight can show you beauty that would make angels weep humble tears, and terrors that the black goat with 1,000 young wouldn't dare use for its kids' bedtime stories. Whatever you see, the good, the bad, the insanity-inducing, it sticks with you forever. You can't ever forget it, and time doesn't blur the memories. It's yours, permanently. Wizards who run around using their sight willy-nilly wind up bonkers. So what does he actually see? My third eye showed me Chicago in its true shape, and for a second I thought I'd been teleported to Vegas. Energy ran through the streets, the buildings, the people, appearing to me as slender filaments of light that ran this way and that, plunging into solid objects and out the other side without interruption. The energies coursing through the grand old buildings had a solid and unmoving stability about them, as did the city streets, but the rest of it, the random energies, generated by the thoughts and emotions of 8 million people, was completely unplanned and coursed everywhere in frenetic, haphazard, garish color. Clouds of emotion were interspersed with the flickering campfire sparks of ideas. Heavy flowing streams of deep thought rolled slowly beneath blazing, dancing gems of joy. The muck of negative emotions clung to surfaces, staining them darker, while fragile bubbles of dreams floated blissfully towards kaleidoscope stars. Holy crap, I could hardly see the lines on the road through all that. So he's going to actually see something that terrifies him in just a moment. But that gives you an idea about what Chicago is really like. As it's going to turn out, Chicago is at a place that has a lot of supernatural connections and residues. So that's going to prove particularly important. And I will say this. So Dresden often works with at least some members of the police. Now, the police, in general, don't wind up seeing all the different things that are happening, trolls and goblins and, vampires and werewolves and all of that. Anything like that is shunted off to special investigations, which his good friend Karen Murphy, was heading for a while, but she has been demoted by the time that we're getting to these stories. She's gotten herself into some trouble through helping Harry out. And actually doing the right thing, fighting against vampires at a particularly crucial time. There's also a criminal underworld, and we have one particular character who entered into the narrative very early on, gentleman John Marcone, who turns out to be a mobster and quite brutal when he needs to be, but never unnecessarily so. And he'll actually get captured and held in these novels and tortured quite a bit. We're also going to see him being a on-again, off-again ally of Dresden, and even at least some of the police involved in this. There's also the FBI who are trying to investigate certain things, and they're going to run into a lot of problems themselves. We have a morgue where some of the action took place earlier on in the series, and we'll see Harry going there to meet with Butters, who's a quiet, unassuming guy who sometimes has to step up and help fight against evil as well, but who's actually just a medical examiner, among other things, a big polka enthusiast as well. And what we're going to find out is that, there's a good description of this along the way in here about how most people aren't seeing what's actually going on. And the supernatural world doesn't take human beings really all that seriously. Here's a great bit from Small Favor. Humanity at large enjoys a dichotomous role in supernatural politics. On the one hand, they're sneered at and held in contempt for being patently unable to come to grips with reality, to the point where the supernatural world hardly needed to bother to hide from them. Given half a chance, the average human being would rationalize the most bizarre of encounters down to unusual but explainable events. They're often referred to as herd animals by a lot of the things that prey upon them, for example, the vampires, and often toyed with and tormented. On the other hand, no one wants to get them stirred up either. Humanity, when frightened and angry, is a force even the supernatural world does not wish to reckon with. The torches and pitchforks are just as deadly in their numbers and their simple rage as they ever were, and it was my opinion that most of the supernatural crowd had very little appreciation for just how destructive and dangerous mankind had grown in the past century. And, what's going on here? He's thinking about the idea of allowing the cops to come in with modern firepower to take on the Denarians. So we'll talk about them in just a moment. But there is one other thing I wanted to bring up early on in this. So these are supernatural detective stories. Harry Dresden is a private investigator. As a matter of fact, in White Knight, he's been brought in to find out who's killing magic users who are at kind of a low level, particularly women in this case. He does a lot of sorting things through, and Murphy is herself a detective, so there's a lot of thought along those lines. And I wanted to read this one particular passage where they're discussing some of the things that have been happening. That's how investigation works most of the time. Cops, detectives, and quixotic wizards hardly ever know which information is pertinent until we've actually got a pretty good handle on what's happening. All you can do is accumulate whatever data you can and hope it falls into a recognizable pattern. And that is exactly what happens in these books. There are some blind ends. There's some people who you think are bad for this reason, and it turns out they're bad for this reason, or they're actually good, and they're trying to help out in some way. There's all sorts of splits in groups that you'd think are completely on the same page. It turns out oftentimes people are misled about what happened in the past. And there's some active misleading as well. For example, Harry hiding the very warden, Morgan, who had come after him so many times, in his place when Morgan comes to him, being sought out by the White Council for having, they think, killed one of the senior members. And all of this is stuff that we have to sort of figure out along the way. The last two things I wanted to say about the Chicagoland setting. So there's a pub that gets described a number of times, and in Changes, we even get to see the guy in charge of it, McNally, Mac, talk a good bit. Usually he's monosyllabic, if at all talking. And it is neutral territory for the most part. There's a few entities that don't regard it as such, but it's considered to be neutral territory, so we can have meetings of enemies or potential rivals taking place there. And if you want to fight, you got to go outside. Mac also produces really great food and brews his own beer and has some pretty wicked liquor available as well. Another major setting that is going to arise here is the island that comes to be known as Demon Reach, when Harry not only, arranges for there to be a battle there, but before he does it, makes contact with the spirit of the island at a confluence of ley lines, these magical power conduits, we could say, where they come together. And Harry is going to actually connect with the spirit of that island and be able to see through its eyes and even do some things because of that. So this is the Chicagoland area that we've described now a good bit, where the action is essentially playing out. But every place within the world, the Earth, is also connected, potentially at least, to the Never Never. And you can make, some pretty good speed hopping through that. They make use of that several times. I also want to bring up one other thing about the Never Never and Chicago that's quite interesting. So Harry has a literal fairy godmother, Leia, or the Leonicida, right? And it turns out that when you leave Harry's apartment, it goes to her realm, right? And why is that the case? Well, we learn that when she became his fairy godmother, because of his mother making this bargain, she's going to tell him, did you not think it strange that in your turmoil-strewn time here, none of your foes, not one, ever sought to enter from the other side into your apartment? Never sent a spirit, given form directly into your bed, your shower, your refrigerator? Never poured a basket of asps into your closet so that they sought refuge in your shoes, your boots, the pockets of your clothing? Sweet, sweet child, had you walked much further, you would have seen the mound of bones of all the things that have attempted to reach you and which I have destroyed. Yeah, well, I nearly wound up there myself. Ah, she said, smiling. My guardians were created to attack any intruder, including one that looked like you. We couldn't have some clever shapeshifter drifting by, now could we? You took a terrible toll on my primroses. Honestly, child, there are elements other than fire. You really ought to diversify. So she says, it has been true for your entire lifetime, child. I've followed you in the spirit world, created defenses and guardians upon the other side to ward your sleep, to stand sentinel over your home, and you have only the beginnings of an idea of how many have tried. She smiled, showing her delicately pointed canine teeth again. Tried and failed. Which also explained how she was always near at hand whenever I'd entered the Never Never, how she would be on my trail in seconds whenever I went in, because she had been there protecting me from everything except herself. So, very interesting stuff going on there. And I suppose since we've brought up the realm of fairy, we should talk about them, because this is a really important part of the storyline. So the Dresden Files take place in a universe in which there are many different kinds of magical entities of different sorts, and they're not all within one big system or hierarchy. They're often at cross purposes with each other, and some of them possess enough power, at least at certain times, to almost dominate the scene, but they always wind up losing in the end. So the fairy courts, the Siddhe, right? We have summer and winter, each of them with a vast number of different creatures and a kind of ruling hierarchy, which includes not just queens and ladies, but also, interestingly, knights. Why do I bring that up? Because Harry Dresden has had contact with both the summer and the winter knights, and himself will become one of them in Changes, an issue that we'll come to a bit later. So we've got this vast array of summer and winter that, strive against each other, sometimes get into warfare with each other. There's wheels within wheels and plots within plots. And the one thing that you can count on with the Siddhe is that if you make a bargain with you, they will stick to the bargain, but generally in ways that will screw you. There's also fairy folk that are much more helpful. So, Harry actually is known as the Pizza Lord, the Za Lord, because he provides some of the fairies in Chicago, especially Toot Toot, who by the time that we're near the end of Changes, has risen to the level of, I believe, Brigadier General, and he keeps on getting bigger through eating more and more pizza. And they wind up helping him out in a variety of different ways, in part because they're often viewed as insignificant by other people. There's also fairies that are not constrained by these structures. And one of them we encountered earlier in the series, the Earl King. As a matter of fact, Harry, Susan, and their pursuers get dumped going through the Never Never in the very midst of the Earl King's territory and have to fight their way out, not against the Earl King, but against the Red Court vampires. So that's one massive part of the structure, right? I mentioned vampires, so let's move on next to them. Vampires exist. They come in a number of different varieties, and the three main ones are associated with what are called courts. So you have the Bram Stoker, scary, undead, rotting corpse, very powerful vampires. Those are the Black Court, and they've largely been sidelined. Once Bram Stoker published Dracula, that was actually a piece that was being used by some of the other courts, primarily the white, to help do in the Black Court, which was viewed as being too powerful. Then there's the Red Courts. Those are the ones that are oriented around feeding on blood and will, turn people into vampires of their sort. But it takes place gradually. First, they change them, as they do with Susan earlier on in the series. And then when they make their first kill, they become a Red Court vampire. And there's many of them, particularly in Central and South America, but that court is very powerful. And during the time of these books, there is open war between the Red Court and the White Council that we'll get to in a moment, with the White Court being, for the time being, neutral. So the White Court, these are the vampires who are also demonic figures, but they feed on emotion. And most of the White Court vampires we've met up until this time have been associated with the Wraiths, so they feed on lust and sexuality. And Lana Wraith is described as this incredibly attractive and sensual vampire woman. Her brother, who is Harry's half-brother, is also sort of like, a male incubus, right? And there's others, though, as well. There's those that feed on fear. There's those that feed on despair, and they play a really central role in White Knight. So different vampire courts doing other things. There's a fourth vampire court that we only read about, references to, but they never enter the story, at least so far as we know, the Jade Court over in China. And the vampires are all kind of at cross purposes with each other. Even the White Court, the Wraiths are on top right now, but the other two are trying to jockey for position. There's fractures even within the the Wraith White Court as well, and the Red Court, and we could go on and on about that. But the vampires are going to play really important roles in this story, particularly the Red Court, as they are trying to outmaneuver the White Council. So we should talk about the White Council. Who are they? They are the wizards. They are not quite the good guys, because right and wrong, good and bad, very often has to give way to other considerations. But they stand for humanity, even though humanity doesn't really know about them. And Harry's a wizard, and so are so many of the other important characters that we're going to encounter. His mother was one, and his father was a magician. His grandfather, who we find out, is the Blackstaff, one of the senior council members. Ebenezer is a majorly powerful wizard. The Merlin, which is a title rather than a name, is supposed to be the most powerful wizard. And they have a council, and they have many, many thousands of wizards in this organization. Although by the time that we're reading this, the war has taken a significant toll. Their military arm is the Wardens. In the White Knight, there's a lot of much younger, lower level magic users who have been kind of left on their own, and they get organized by Harry's first girlfriend, Elaine, into a kind of organization that can be a feeder to the White Council. So that's quite important as well. However, that's not the only council. Harry and other people suspect that there's a what they call Black Council with at least one member of the White Council belonging to them manipulating things behind the scenes. And that's a significant part of the entire storyline that we're going to be delving into. That's where the investigative work comes in, trying to figure out who could it be, using theories, using information, trying it out in different combinations. So there's all of this, the vampires, the fairy world, the wizards and the White Council. There's also bad wizards, or rather warlocks, those who engage in black magic, and some of them are incredibly powerful. Harry runs into some who he can't effectively face, like Cowell, who is a necromancer, earlier and also in White Knight. So there's all of that. And then we can get into, you might say, religious motifs. One of the main set of antagonists is Nicomedeus and the other fallen or denarians. There are 30 denarii, which is what, Judas was paid in, and each of these coins contains the essence of a demon that can give you great power, but will also take you over. And Harry actually has one of these coins buried in his apartment. Why? Because it was almost given to one of Michael, one of the Knight of the Swords, his youngest child. And Harry has within his head a facsimile of the demon of that coin who's trying to seduce him, Laskiel, into accepting it. And Harry will actually be, not only tempted, but actively consider taking on that power at different points, a theme that we'll get to later. But the Denarians are incredibly actively involved in this plot, particularly in Small Favors, where they are the central antagonists as well. So, that's another wrinkle to it, and that introduces what we might call the level of gods and divinities. So I mentioned Knights of the Sword. Harry has a very good friend, Michael, who is a Knight of the Sword, well, partly through these books. Eventually he's going to retire, leaving just Sasha, and Harry is the keeper then for 2 of the swords. Some other people will take up these swords, including Murphy, incredibly, right? She takes up one of these blazing white spiritual swords. There's only 3 of them. And even Susan will take on one of the swords in these books as well. To wield the sword, you must have an intention that is pure. And so Harry doesn't really trust himself with that much of the time. But there are some people who can effectively do that. And they are serving God, the Christian God, even if, like Sasha, they're unbelievers and would rather attribute a lot of this stuff to extraterrestrials, right? So there's Christianity flowing into it and angels as well. Harry meets Uriel, that particular angel who's taken an interest in him and gives him a capacity that is correlative to what the Denarians had given him. The Denarians gave him the ability to use hellfire to amp up his magic. Uriel gives him the ability to use soul fire, to draw upon his own soul, creative magic rather than destructive. So that's one, let's call it, narrative mythology woven in there. But there's also the mythology of, we could say, the Dharmic religions and Chinese religion. Harry actually has a foo dog. He has, this puppy. This is from, much earlier story. His dog, Mouse, who, by the way, is quite sentient, can speak in certain circumstances, incredibly smart, incredibly powerful, is one of Harry's companions. And along with him, for some sort of greater purpose. There's also Norse mythology woven into it. We get to meet Odin under the guise of Donar Vadrung, who, it turns out, has not just a company, but is in Midgard. And how does Harry find that out? Well, he comes along with Gard, who is one of the bodyguards of John Marcone, who turns out to be Sigrun, one of the Valkyries, prefigured a little bit when she comes in with a helicopter blaring Wagner's Flight of the Valkyries in Small Favor, right? So there's a lot of really cool stuff happening here. Not all godlike entities are necessarily on the side of good, however. We have 2 that we should also talk about. So the Skinwalker, or the Naglishi, who we encounter in Turncoat, is an incredibly powerful being who is almost as old as time itself, used to serve the forces of good, and then decided to go off on its own. And there are humans that can be turned into skinwalkers, but they encounter one of the original ones who's of basically godlike power, sort of like Odin in this story. And then we have creatures that are called outsiders. Harry's actually encountered one of these before. The demon, at least he thought it was a demon, who was after him when he was younger and may still be, is one of those outsiders. And we encounter people bringing in outsiders, which are essentially, think Lovecraftian beings. They're outside of all of these spectra and kind of don't care about any of this. We also, to come back to Chicago, have all sorts of ghosts in Chicago, unrestful spirits. We encounter a young girl who's called the Archive, and I should bring all this together by mentioning, I brought this up already. There's accords, the Unseelie Accords, that kind of govern how the different sides work with each other or are in conflict with each other. and moderate that conflict to some degree, although people try to find ways around it. Gentleman John Marcone will become a signatory to that as a free lord of the Unseelie Accords, which is what allows the Denarians to go after him. We also have this creature called the Archive, who plays a central role in the story as well. And she's got incredible powers, as does her guardian, Kincaid, who, by the way, Murphy had a relationship with and still does kind of off and on throughout the stories. And she is this repository of information, which is why the Denarians want to capture her in small favor. So this is all a lot of like character stuff, but a lot of background to the world that is revealed bit by bit by bit. Most of it is happening through Dresden's eyes and experiences and his thoughts, but there's a lot of dialogue where we're getting information from other characters as well. For example, when Odin is telling him about how things stand and showing him what the power of a god might be like before Harry is going to try and face the entire Red Court on his own, including the Red King. So all of this is part of the world that Dresden has built. It's going to change, especially in the book Changes. Now that we've given you kind of a lay of the land talking about the world building and the different realms involved and, a lot of the, let's call them factions or powers that are coordinating parts of them at odds with each other, that's kind of a static picture. And it's important because these are, in fact, novels and they're part of one big dramatic arc, that we think about the plots and, to a lesser extent, the characters and their involvements, the allies, the enemies, those who turn out to be a little bit of both involved in these stories, and what is going to change. So this is the part of the discussion where lots and lots of spoilers are going to come up. If you don't want spoilers, you probably want to put your fingers in your ears or definitely turn off closed captioning and turn off the sound and wait until we get to the end of this part, or maybe skip ahead or whatever it's going to be, because there's going to be some big spoilers, particularly when we get to Changes, which is so aptly named. So each of these novels is going to begin with kind of a problem. Sometimes they're a bigger problem than others. You could say that White Knights is going to begin a little bit more slow and small scale than the other ones where we're jumping right into the heart of things, right? White Knight begins with Murphy, as usual, bringing Dresden in for a suspicious case, a suicide that might not really be a suicide. And we're going to get a larger picture in that. Small favors, we jump in at the very start with the smaller of the Billy Goats Gruff going after Harry and actually some of Michael and Charity's kids and in their yard. And we also have Mab showing up on the scene, which is almost never a good thing as well, demanding a favor of Harry. Turncoat, man, that one is beginning really in the middle of things. Harry's nemesis, who's been waiting to cut his head off since the very first book, Morgan, one of the wardens, who is pretty high status, by the way, who trained under somebody who Harry's going to get involved in, Anastasia, right? He is showing up at Harry's place and saying, I've been framed. You're the only person who can help me. He's also wounded as well. Then we get Changes, and you can't get a crazier start than that. Harry finds out he has an 8-year-old daughter by Susan, Rodriguez, who is a partly turned Red Court vampire, also in the St. Giles network fighting the Red Court down in South and Central America. And their daughter has been kidnapped to be used in a ritual. So each of them is beginning with something, and we see, lots of detective work and having to figure things out and conflicts going on. Each of them is going to culminate in a big battle. And now I don't say end, but rather culminate. And there's a reason I say that. There's always like kind of an epilogue to each of them where we're going to learn a bit more, pick up the pieces, get ready for the transition to the next book that will generally begin like a year and a half after the previous book in this series. Now, Changes does not only have an epilogue, Changes also does have an end. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. That's where the hugest of the spoilers are going to be, the things that are really changing the narrative universe. So let's begin. I want to do a couple sort of like quick sketches, lead you through what's going on in these texts. White Knight, again, we have an apparent suicide of a magic practitioner, as it's going to turn out, and they figure out there is actually a serial killer out there of magic practitioners. As a matter of fact, it looks like it might not just be one. There's at least two of them doing things, and they're trying to pin it on either a warden using a gray cloak, or perhaps even Harry's vampire half-brother Thomas Wraith of the White Court, who has been really doing his best to not be vampirish, but Harry is going to have to suspect him a bit, and actually Murphy is kind of, suspicious of him as well. And then they discover that this has been going on not just in Chicago. People have been disappearing, dying, committing suicide in weird circumstances all over cities. And they all turn out to be sort of like low to mid-level magic users. This is actually part of a big plot, as we're going to find out. And it has to do with the White Court. The White Court of Vampires, there's the Wraiths who are on top, and they are oriented around feeding through lust. There's also the Scavis, who feed on despair, and the Mavora, who feed on fear. And they're kind of all jockeying for position, trying to take power from each other. And there are traitors both in the different courts and the different lineages. So, for example, Madrigal Wraith is going to be connected with somebody who we thought was dead, who isn't, Cowell. And they're going to be able to bring in ghouls, who are super, super powerful entities, as it turns out. There's going to be a big conflict at the end that Harry is going to be deeply involved in, but we also get, Gentleman John Marcone and some of the White Court vampires involved in it. And it's quite interesting. Harry is going to be drawing upon the hellfire that having the image or shadow of Laskiel, the fallen Denarian, in his head gives him. And she is going to save his bacon in the end. Exercise something like free will. Choose to sacrifice herself for Harry, in the process burning out bits of his brain and taking away parts of his soul. And, there's a huge confrontation. What ends up happening is the baddies lose. The goodies plus some other baddies win. One of them is Lara Wraith, and Harry is going to actually force a kind of set of terms upon her. So I wanted to bring these up. she asks, well, what do you want that I might give you? First, reparations, a weregild to the victims' families. Second, this never happens again. One of yours starts up with genocide again, and I'm going to reply in kind, starting with you. Third, the little folk, the fairies, shouldn't be in cages. Free them unharmed in my name. And she does all those. As it turns out, this was part of an idea that the White Court vampires had, that, if you can destroy the up-and-coming human magic users, like a couple generations of them, the White Council is going to be extremely weakened. So that could be good for the White Court, the Red Court, and the Black Court vampires. A little bit later, Harry is with Iain, who is his first girlfriend, fellow student, all sorts of other things at the time as well, when they face off against his terrible first mentor. And he's going to tell her, I got weregild for the dependents. And he asks about contact information, and she says, well, some of them didn't have any dependents. And so he says, yeah, I thought we might use the money to build something. What is it? We expand the Ordo, build a network of contacts, a hotline for middle-class practitioners. We contact groups like the Ordo in cities all around the country. We put the word out that if people are in some kind of supernatural fix, they can get word of it out onto the network. Maybe if something like this starts happening again, we can hear about it early and stomp on the fire before it grows. We teach self-defense classes. We help people coordinate, cooperate, support one another. We act. Elaine asks, we? You said you wanted to help people. I said, this might. What do you think? And she says, I think that Anna, one of the characters who's died, would have liked that. So what we get here is a new institution. Things are changing within the wizardry world, right? And Dresden is part of that. Second story in this sequence, Book 10, Small Favors, begins, as I mentioned, really taking off at the start. Harry is being attacked by the Billy Goats Gruff, who are part of the summer court, and he's trying to figure out what the hell's going on with that. So not only does he have that happening, and as he manages to fight off each successive group, their bigger brother comes in as well, right? Which is quite funny. This fairy tale turns out to be partly true. We've also got Queen Mab, the Queen of Winter, involved in the story as well. The small favor she wants is for him to find and recover Gentleman John Marcone, who has been kidnapped. Now, she holds several favors over Harry. She's also after Harry to become the Winter Knight. And Mab is scary as hell. She has to speak through others because her own voice is so terrifying to hear. So, who are we going to find has actually taken Marcone? Well, as it happens, it's Nicodemus and the Denarians, and we've seen them before in previous stories. They are being opposed by the Knights of the Swords, who are going to play a big role in this as well. They're down one member, as we know, from the previous stories, but they still have two knights functioning. One of whom is a great friend of Harry, Michael. And Harry has actually taken on their kid, Chastity and Michael, Molly, as his apprentice in just earlier works, right? So what we're going to find out is that the Denarians' kidnapping of Marcone is actually a violation of the Unseelie Accords, because Marcone, at the very end of White Knight, was made, by Harry's advice, a freeholding baron of them. So he's actually part now of the whole magical universe. By the way, too, Laskiel, the demoness who's in the Denarius, now since we're talking about Denarians, her reflection, her shadow, her projection into Harry's head saved the day, but destroyed herself. and Laskiel is still in the Denarius, in Harry's basement. The other Denarians are on the scene now and trying both to recruit, they'd love to get Harry involved, but also to destroy, to do as much damage as they possibly can. And as it turns out, there's a big plot going on. So Harry is going to, and the White Council will invoke the Unseelie Accords. He gets to decide who the arbiter will be. He chooses somebody we've encountered before, Ivy / the Archive. And this is going to be pretty momentous. So we're going to find out that here's what Harry says. Ivy is the Archive. A long time ago, we don't know when, somebody we don't know who created the Archive, a kind of intellectual construct, a kind of entity composed of pure information. Think of it as software for the brain, Lucio said, like a very advanced database management system. Then Harry says, the Archive is passed from one generation to the next, mother to daughter, all the memories of the previous bearers of the Archive and all the facts they've gathered. All that knowledge makes the Archive powerful, and it was created as a repository of learning, a safeguard against the possibility of a cataclysm of civilization, a loss of all knowledge, the destruction of all learning. It was bound in neutrality to the preservation and gathering of knowledge. Gathering? Murphy says, so the Archive reads a lot? It goes deeper than that, I said. The Archive is magic, so complex it's practically alive, and it just knows. Anything that gets printed or written down, the Archive knows. And then Harry says, that's what Nicky and the Nickelheads have taken, the Denarians, right? That's his jokey name for them. And Murphy says, well, with that kind of information at their disposal, they could, my God, they could blackmail officials, control governments. Launch nuclear warheads, I said. Stop thinking so small. I nodded at Michael. Remember you told me Nicodemus was playing Armageddon Lotto. He makes big plans, but he plots them out so he can make an incremental profit along the way. This is just one more scheme. Michael frowned. He was after the Archive all along. He deliberately came here and provoked a confrontation to get you to call her and to arbitrate. And turns out, yeah, that was the plan. And so he's going to torture her and try to get her to break. And there is a massive confrontation that's going to take place on this island northeast of Chicago in Lake Michigan that Harry is going to connect with in a different way in the next book and actually call Demon Reach. And what we're going to find is ultimately there's a huge battle between the Denarians and the Knights of the Sword. Michael, unfortunately, is going to get shot up so badly he's going to have to retire. Murphy will be there. Mouse will be there. Molly will be there. And we also get two important people from Marcone's organization, Hendricks and Guard. Now, Guard, as we are going to find out later, is not just a really tall, tough lady. She's a Valkyrie. So that's going on. And we come to a sort of close near the end of this. By the way, Harry by now is getting involved with Marcone, not Marcone, with Anastasia, right? And so we find out what Mab really wanted. So we're going to learn why she wanted the Denarian stop. And why did she intervene and send, why recruit me to save the Archive and Marcone in the event that the Hobbs failed? Mab says, Nicodemus and his ilk were clearly in violation of my accords and obviously planning to abuse them to further his ambition. That was reason enough to see his designs disrupted, and among the fallen was one with much to answer to me, personally, for its attack on my home. And so she says, the Watchmen and I had a common enemy this day. The enemy could not be allowed to gain the power represented by the child Archive. Now, who's the Watchman? Uriel. Sorry, I was a little bit mistaken there. Uriel the angel. Harry encounters him after they're in the hospital, and Harry is praying in the way that he can in the hospital chapel. The janitor turns out to be one of the great archangels and gives Harry a power to draw upon, instead of hellfire, soul fire. And Harry's going to be using that to amp up his magic considerably. So, a lot going on in that one. As I mentioned, Turncoat begins with Morgan showing up, the last person that you'd expect to be there. And the question is, who is framing him? Because Harry knows that Morgan is quite an ass and, very bitter about a lot of stuff. But Morgan's a straight shooter. Morgan would not have done the things that they're attributing to him. And so Thomas and him will see if it's maybe one of his relatives, Madeline Wraith, who's actually going to play a big role in this, another one of the White Court vampires. There's going to be two baddies who Harry and company are going to encounter along the way. One of them is human, a wizard, a mercenary, who can call creatures out of the never never, and does that, and it's quite difficult for him. The other is practically a god, the Nagloshi, the skinwalker, who has been hunting Michael as well, and now is after quite a few people in the process. And the Nagloshi is going to kidnap Thomas to try to get a swap of Morgan for Thomas. And it looks like the Nagloshi is contracted to by somebody to get this. Dresden is eventually going to organize essentially a showdown happening again on that island, which now he connects with. And he names it Demon Watch, and he can see through all the eyes and even the trees and the wind of the island. It's on ley line, so there's a lot of power to draw upon. And we get a big battle with multiple sides happening. And it turns out they figure out who one of the traitors in the White Council is. Turns out to be the guy who does all the paperwork, who has been using ink infused with certain drugs and magical elements to get into everybody's heads. And that's a big deal, especially for Harry, because it turns out that Anastasia, who he's had this relationship with, Lucio, the captain of the wardens, he's had this very torrid relationship with, as she's in her new body, she had been influenced. And so they weren't really made for each other, and their relationship is going to break up. Morgan is going to die in the end, but he's going to die essentially vindicated in the eyes of everybody who knows rightly. Ebenezer is there. We get to see some of the other White Council people. And Ebenezer is going to reveal some interesting stuff about Harry. Now remember that Ebenezer was Harry's mentor, who took him on much the way that Harry took on Molly later on as a ward, right? So a lot of really important stuff happening in here. And then finally we get changes. And holy crap, is there a lot of stuff that's going on there. As I mentioned, his 8-year-old daughter with Susan has been kidnapped by the Red Court Duchess Ariana, who is now trying to also steer the White Council into peace. And she's there in Edinburgh in the White Council. There's a couple people who have been promoted who probably shouldn't have been, who might themselves be traitors or just incompetent. And there's something going on with this whole plot. So it turns out that a lot of the fighting with this is going to be with the Red Court. So there's the whole Ariana's machinations thing, and then there's a hit people couple, the Ibs, Esteban and Esmeralda Baptiste, who are going after Harry. They blow up his office. Eventually, they're going to blow up his apartment as well, actually burn it down rather than blow it up. And they have a monster with them that is called the Ikuox. Harry just calls it the Ick, and it's pretty terrifying, pretty hard to kill. So there's a lot going on. Harry gets investigated by the FBI. Murphy and the FBI agent actually are able to get along pretty well. But there's also a guy who's kind of gunning for Murphy and for Harry Dresden, who's working for the Red Court as well. And what we're going to see ended up happening is as they get out of the FBI building, they have to go into the Never Never. Where do they wind up? In the Earl King's court with all of his goblins around. And there's a duel that's going to take place between the sort of champions. Well, Harry and Harry doesn't get to essentially have a champion himself. But the Ick is going to be dispatched at that point, and the Earl King will let them go. But the Eeks stay behind and get, I suppose, eaten by the goblins, or actually tortured is how it's put. Then we're going to lead up to this massive confrontation down in Central America on the confluence of ley lines in the very heart of the Red Court. The Red King, the oldest of the vampires, the Red Court vampires, Ariana's been kind of gunning for his position. Harry, along with all the people who come along with him, and there's quite a few who are involved in this, including his fairy godmother, are going to force a duel between Harry and Ariana, which he's going to win. And then the Red King will betray them. And now what has all this been about? Well, there's a blood curse that they want to release. And by sacrificing Harry's daughter, they will kill Susan and Harry, but they'll also kill everybody in their lineage. So this will kill Thomas, for example, his brother. It'll kill older members of the family. Now, Harry's parents are both dead, but as it turns out, his grandfather is very alive. His grandfather is Ebenezer. So, killing one of the greatest of the White Council wizards, the Black Staff himself, is part of what they're after. And the Black Staff is going to show up in the fighting, along with the rest of the Grey Council that Ebenezer has managed to organize. Leancita is also going to be involved in this as well. That's Harry's fairy godmother. She's fighting in this. She also reveals to Harry that she has been protecting him this entire time. Guess who else we get in this? Queen Mab. Harry has to make a very difficult decision. Mab has been after him for quite a while. She wants him to be the Winter Knight. And Harry winds up becoming disabled because of what happens when his apartment is being burned. And he still has to save his daughter, right? So he calls to Mab, and she shows up. And he says, this is a limited time offer. If you don't get off your royal ass and jump on it, I'm walking, right? And she shows up, and so does his godmother, right? And she's speaking through his godmother's mouth. So many scars. Your scars are beautiful things, within and without. Yes, said the cold voice coming from the Leancita's lips. I can work with this. For your sake. Mab was closing the circle about me. Why for my sake? The cold voice laughed through Leansida's lips. This conversation would quickly grow tedious if you kept falling to your knees, screaming in agony and clawing at your bleeding ears, my wizard. But why? Why would your voice hurt me? Because she's angry, answered the Leansida in her natural voice, because her voice is part of her power and her rage is too great to be contained. I swallowed. Mab had spoken a few years to me a couple of years back, and I'd reacted exactly as she's described. Rage? About what? We don't find out. My godmother bowed her head to Mab, and the cold voice came from her mouth again. It is not for my handmaiden to judge or question me, nor to speak for me on her own account. So, Mab says, speak your desire, mortal man. Power, I said. Tell me why. My body is badly injured, but I must do battle with the Red Court. This you have done many a time. This time I'm fighting all of them, I said, the Red King and his inner circle. The fire of her eyes intensified. Tell me why. I swallowed and said, they've taken my daughter. Ah, yes, not for your own life, but for your child's, for love. So many terrible things are done for love. For love will men mutilate themselves and murder rivals. For love will even a peaceful man go to war. For love man will destroy himself, and that right willingly. You know my price, mortal, speak it. You want me to become the winter night, I whispered. A laugh, both merry and cold, bubbled beneath her response. Yes, I will, I said, with a condition. Speak it. That before my service begins, you restore my body to health, that you grant me enough time to rescue my daughter and take her to safety, and strength and knowledge to succeed. And you give me your word you'll never command me to lift my hand against those I love. You ask me to risk my night in a place of dire peril to no gain for my land and people. Why should I do this? Here's where Harry makes it an option. If you don't want to do business, I'll go elsewhere. I could still call Laskiel's coin to me in a heartbeat, and Nicodemus and the Denarians would be more than happy to help me. I'm also one of the only people alive who knows how to pull off Kemmler's Dark Hallow. So if Nicky and the Nickelheads don't want to play, I can damned well get the power for myself. And the next time I call your name, I won't need to be nearly so polite. Mab let a mirthless laugh through my godmother's lips. You are spoiled for choices, my wizard. What reason have you to select me over the others? I grimaced. Please don't take this as an insult, but you're the least evil of my options. So Harry is going to do that. He is going to become the Winter Knight. And we find that he has to choose, and he does so by killing the other Winter Knight in Mab's ritual. So that is pretty big stuff. We also find out at the end of this that the blood curse is going to be enacted on this, incredibly powerful set up, we could say, confluence of ley lines and altar and all of that. But who's going to die? It won't be Harry and Susan's child. It's Susan. And Harry has to stab her and kill her. And he does. The love of his life, the mother of his child. And with Susan dying as a Red Court vampire, that means that all of the Red Court in her lineage are destroyed, including the Red King himself. The Red Court, by the end of this story, has effectively been destroyed. One entire vampire court of 3 or 4, if we want to count the Jade, has been taken off the map. That's a big, big deal. Now, 2 other things happen that are going to bring this to a close. Murphy is going to lose her job. That's a big deal for Murphy. But Murphy says, well, I think I'm going to, go and get drunk and all that. And Harry says, I'll join you. But what happens at the very end? Well, as he's getting ready to go out, my foot slipped a little and I nearly lost my balance just as something smacked into the wall of the cabin behind me, a sharp popping sound like a rock thrown against a wooden fence. I turned and it felt slow for some reason. I looked at the water beetle's cabin bulkhead, whatever behind me, and thought, who splattered red paint on my boat? Then my left leg started to fold all by itself. I looked down at a hole in my shirt just to the left of my sternum. I thought, why did I pick the shirt with a bullet hole in it? And then I fell off the boat, the back of the boat, and into the icy water of Lake Michigan. Harry is dead. Harry's actually saying, as he's thinking his last stuff, typical. Even when you're dead, it doesn't get any easier. That is how Changes ends. Now, that's a huge, huge turn of events, isn't it? So lots of really important stuff happening in these stories that is changing the world that they are living in and even dying in. When we're fortunate enough to have a lot of declarations and explanations by an author of what it is that they're up to, how they understand their characters, their plots, their universe, and even how they relate themselves to fans, it's good to explore that. We've already done that a bit in the previous sessions on Jim Butcher, but I selected out a number of things that are coming in part from interviews, but also from Reddit AMAs or things that Jim Butcher has said at various cons or even in emails, and in one case, a little bit of his own writing from the standpoint of Morgan that might be a bit good to go over. Certainly illuminating for me, perhaps they will be for you. And so I'm going to jump right into one of the things that he said in one of the Reddit AMAs. So the person wrote, recurrent in your books are characters who do things they describe as wrong but necessary. From the Black Staff, that is Ebenezer, who we are going to find out in Changes is actually related to Dresden, to Gaius Sextus. What interests you about this moral gray area where ends and means must be weighed against one another? And so here's what Butcher says. When I was a kid, I got beat up a lot. I was the second smallest kid in class, the smartest, and it's just possible I may have shot my mouth off a few times, mostly over matters of right and wrong. As a result, I've always been fascinated with power and its exercise. How do you use it properly? How do you use it responsibly? What is or is not an abuse of power? Can it be wielded without corrupting those who hold it? Those are some serious questions. It's always been a goal of mine to be a good man, but how do you do that if you don't know what it means? What does it mean? What does it cost? Turns out being a decent human being is confusing and hard if you really think about everybody involved. But the Dresden Files are about the wielding and abuse of power. Always have been. In the Dragon Con 2014, he's asked, one of my favorite parts of your novels are the divine and the demonic and how they offer each other and how they have rules. And I wanted to ask, what made you decide Chicago wasn't enough and all creation has to be at stake? And then Butcher says, well, it's not all of creation. It's just all of this creation. We haven't really pulled the camera back far enough yet. There's a lot of reality in the Dresden Files. The Dresden Files is a universe that's driven by free will, and every time you make a choice, it creates a new universe. So there's this vast spectrum of universe out there, and it's not just ours. There's causality going off in every direction. So a philosophical war on that scale is something that's just so tremendous you can barely imagine it. And while it dwarfs into unimportance our particular universe, at the same time, the only way to win that war is one choice at a time, one person at a time. And that's really what's going on at the level where the angels are operating. That's what they're concerned about. On the level where Dresden's operating, it's like, how can I survive to the next chapter? And that's sort of the problem that we've got as people. How do we look out and try to fix the things that are wrong with our world when we're basically going, how do I get to the next chapter? How can we have the longer point? Do we need it? I don't know the answers to that, but I enjoy the hell out of torturing Dresden with them. That's really the kind of point of what I do. So two very interesting responses there that contextualize what the author is doing with his character and the other characters involved in the story. In fantasy literature interview, we come to the not final book. I almost was tempted to say that, but the final book in this sequence, Changes, which really does change things. And we read the next upcoming book of yours is Changes, the 12th of the Dresden Files. The title seems apt, judging from what's been let out so far. There's big things afoot. Even the title itself is a departure. Previous books have all had titles of 2 words of equal length. It starts to seem like the series is entering its second phase. Is this an accurate assumption? And what changes will this entail for readers? So here's what Butcher says. I would actually call this the series' third or even fourth phase if I was going to use words like phase to describe the progression. I tend to work on an event-by-event basis. Now, does that make sense? Yes. We could certainly say that by the end of the 4th book and perhaps at the end of the 8th book, we've got some really important turning points that also happens at the end of the 12th book. So, maybe books 9 through 12 are a third phase, and now we're going into the 4th phase with Ghost Story and what comes after that. And then they also, here, get a question. Something a lot of readers enjoy about the Dresden Files is while the books stand alone, they also build a larger story and overall arc. You've previously mentioned a plan involving 20 books capped by an apocalyptic trilogy. How's that plan holding up so far? And this is something that Butcher has talked about in a number of places. He says, I'm a couple books behind my original outline. At this point, I'm telling everyone the series will be 20-ish books, followed by a trilogy. The net result is that there will probably be at least a couple more case books like we've seen so far, which means that Changes would be roughly about at the halfway point, perhaps a little bit before the total arc of the series. Now, coming back to Changes, in the MarsCon sessions, the interviewer says, speaking of Changes, how many people here were ready to form a lynch mob? And Jim Butcher says, officers, here they are. And then the interviewer says, did you get a lot of trouble from your editors about that? And he says, they were like, what are you doing? And I assured them that, no, I'm not ending the series there. And they're like, but. They sounded like that. And I said, okay. And I wrote the first 3 chapters of the next book and sent it to them. And they went, oh. And I'm like, come on. My kid's just starting college. I'm not going to end the Dresden Files now. And then once they had the idea of what Ghost Story was going to be like and be about, it was much more. They were much more amenable to it, right? Because, after all, Dresden is dead at the end of Changes. So you got to have some way to make sense of that. Now, one of the key characters that they're seeking after in Changes is Dresden's and Susan's daughter, right? Now, here's something about the narrative arc. So he's asked, this is in the Kansas City Release Party Q&A, as an author, when did you know that Maggie existed? So Butcher says, by book 3. So 9 books later, Maggie comes into the picture, right? By book 3, I realized, oh, wait a minute, I have to do this because I remember there being some huge uproar on the list and I was still kind of keeping track of things at the time. And there's nothing that will get me riled up faster than a discussion on the internet. There was somebody upset about the Laurel Hamilton books and going on steady with the argument that these books devolved into BDSM sex that have nothing to do with the plot. So one of the counter arguments was, how could you possibly have a BDSM sex scene that was actually plot relevant in any way? Jim makes the facial equivalent of, well, it could be done, plot relevant, there you go. So her existence was planned, though the specifics didn't get settled until a year later. But book 3 is where I figured it out. That is, connecting Harry Dresden with Susan, his, for quite a while, girlfriend, and as it's going to turn out, mother of his child that he finds out about when she's 8 years old, so considerably later. Now, another key element of Changes is that Harry has been pursued by all of these different, let's call them factions or people who want to bring him in and line him up with themselves. And one of the options that's asked about here in the Reddit AMA is the Dark Hallow. How exactly would the version of Changes where Harry does the Dark Hallow have gone afterwards? Seems like the kind of thing that would burn his bridges with absolutely everybody. And so Butcher says, well, definitely with the White Council and with a lot of human authorities, but if he'd become a necromancer, he would have found his allies among the dead and dead adjacent, and things would have gone generally a lot gothier, right? So some very interesting reflections about what's happening in Changes with these turning points. Then we're going to talk about monsters a bit and what he has to say about those. So in the 2009 Kansas City Q&A, he's asked, why did you set up the vampires into 3 different courts? And Butcher says, well, I didn't want to do a kind of stock Hollywood vampire. I was kind of tired of that. And everybody was doing it still. This was in the early 90s, and they were telling everybody, stop writing vampire fiction. It's about to die. So I decided, well, what if the Hollywood version that we have is not the truth, but is the result of several fragments that we've put together? So, very interesting sort of narrative framework there, which we see running throughout the Dresden Files, right? The picture that we have, whether it's police reports or novels or folk tales, even as Butcher's going to say in some other interviews, we're getting things through Harry's eyes, through his point of view. It's not always exactly like that. So he goes on and says, what if the vampires are built on the same principles as the blind men and the elephant? Which is that you've got a bunch of different blind men. This comes from Jain epistemology originally and gets used by everybody, down to the present in self-help books and stuff like that. They all feel the elephant and they think it's different things. He says, I broke out the 3 broad different vampire elements. One was that they were this hideous monster dead things that crawled out of the grave and back. Black court vampires, right? The other was that they were these blood-drinking monsters who were driven by their hunger and could never be sated. Red court vampires. The third one was that they were just damn hot and sexy. White court vampires. So I said, okay, we'll have the hot and sexy vampires, the bloodlust vampires, and the animated corpse vampires. That will be 3 times as many vampires, and that makes things harder on Harry. And I'm always for that. My whole career is based on torturing Harry Dresden. We get a little bit more specific talking about the White Court, who are coming up, quite a bit in, of course, White Knight. The 3 families of the White Court feed on different emotions. Is that like knife, spoon, fork, or can they mix it up? And what are those different emotions? Just a reminder, we've got lust and sexuality, right? We've got fear, and then we've got despair. So Butcher says, well, they can mix it up, and it's one of the things they fight about a lot, about what they do. There's all this you are what you eat sort of thing in play, and the different houses have different aspects. They divide things up by territory, and you could feed on all sorts of stuff. You could possibly be a White Court vampire that fed on the warm, happy feeling that people get when they're holding a puppy. Although you'd probably sparkle a bit if you did that. It might actually be fun to show that in some future files. Come back to the vampire courts in the Reddit AMA. He's asked, what are the other 3 vampire courts who are like mosquitoes in influence compared to the other courts called, major courts called, and will we see them in the future? And he says, no, you won't see courts because they don't have them. There are other vampires around, but they aren't as large and organized as the courts have been, and they can't operate with the same kind of coordination. The exception to that is the Jade Court, who rarely act outside of the Yangtze River Valley. Everyone knows they exist. No one's quite sure where. They don't respond to invitations or offer any of their own. They never deal directly with outsiders, but move through allies and agents. They're not signatories of the Unseelie Accords, but everyone speaks of and treats them as if they are because some fairly horrible things have happened to people over the centuries who showed too much disrespect. The mosquito-type vamps, though, operate mostly in Southeast Asia, mostly in SK, Thailand, and that region. They're thugs, a branch of the Tongs, running drugs and human slaves through the local seas and sometimes hiring out as assassins. So, a lot of interesting stuff about the vampires there. And then we're going to shift to talking about Morgan, who is massively central in Turncoat and was so important earlier in the story, right? He is the sword of Damocles hanging over Harry's head in the early books. He is the one who is going to be a, sort of second sword of Damocles hanging over Michael's daughter, the warlock, Molly, who really did some bad stuff without necessarily meaning to, broke the laws of magic. Harry vouches for her, takes her on as an apprentice, and so, Morgan is kind of the big threat for all of that. So, we get this interesting discussion going on where Butcher says Morgan wasn't about to win any popularity contests inside the council or out of it, but everyone knew he was bad news. He wasn't liked by anyone, but he was respected by most of the council and their allies and feared by their enemies. Harry just happened to be in that latter category for a longest time as far as Morgan was concerned. Morgan scared the bejesus out of Harry on several levels, which is why Harry's point of view towards Morgan was so freaking skewed. Harry always saw him as the Javert-esque persecutor of warlocks and wayward wizards. For anyone else, that was only part of Morgan's identity. Mainly to them, he was the guy from the White Council who was most likely to kick down your door, burn your wicked minions to ash and fire and brimstone, then divide you into several distinct non-entities with his sword. The killing baby warlocks thing was just his sideline. Harry doesn't have Morgan's experience or expertise in a fight. It doesn't mean that Harry isn't also an effective and dangerous opponent, but he has a completely different approach, and he generally has a lot more to learn still before he is as formidable as someone like Morgan. Granted, Ebenezer, the Blackstaff, Harry's grandfather, makes Morgan look like Harry. But hey, there's always somebody bigger or better than you, right? And then, here's where we get a rare treat, something I came across called Microfiction, number 2 journal by Jim Butcher. So this is a letter of Morgan written to Anastasia, his own teacher, who he was in love with for a while, right? Who also is going to, play a role in Turncoat, particularly as she and Harry are involved with each other in the previous novels as well. So here's what Morgan says. I haven't kept this journal since my 70s. I only started it because I thought it would make a good impression on Anastasia, who I presume will be reading this entry. I will spare you the schoolboy platitudes, my teacher. My old friend, though you have never said it, I've always known that you have always known my heart. Now I return to these papers and read the last few pages and realize the lessons that keeping this journal would have taught me might have prevented this from being my last entry. My final confession, really. There's little time and far too much to say. I'm losing blood and my thoughts wander when I must be concise. Despite my promise to Margaret, I failed to protect her son. I tracked him and his father until the time of Malcolm's death. To this day, I'm not sure who killed him. I suppose it's possible Malcolm's death was natural, but given this child's ongoing misfortune, it seems clear to me he's been marked with an adversary from the moment of his birth. Malcolm died while I was on mission elsewhere. I arrived less than 10 hours after the child went into the foster care system, and someone made him vanish. Magically, physically, bureaucratically. There was no trace of him, and I searched for years. That bastard, Justin de Morn, got to him before I could. The evil wizard who took in Harry and Elaine, right? From then on, we could not be sure the child was not molded to be a creature of nemesis. The child apparently murdered Justin in something very like a duel, and I'm unsure if I am more frightened by the prospect it was a deception to simulate Justin's death, or it wasn't. Given what is at stake, it would have been better to remove the child from play, but the Black Staff couldn't let his daughter's son be neutralized. So I tracked him. I hounded him. I pushed him constantly in an attempt to draw out any controls that may have been in place or any corruption of black magic he might have been concealing. Even now, I cannot be sure he's not the monster we all fear in the process of being born. But the enemy has invaded the senior council itself. And regardless of his true allegiance, Dresden is not ensnared in the web of conflicts between them and has both the inclination and the strength to defy them, at least for a time. Until I'm certain where to lay the blame for Lefortier's death, I will seek his assistance. Given who he is, he will have little choice but to give it. If nothing else, the pressure might show me his true colors. This is referring to Morgan as he's falsely accused of Lefortier's death. Going to Harry as the one person who is least likely to take him in, and therefore the location where he's least likely to be found. Then he says, perhaps I've been too hard on him. Perhaps I really have become paranoid and mad. Perhaps I've wronged a good man. But there's too much at stake to take that chance. The thought of allowing a destroyer to be birthed among us when I could have stopped him is too heavy to bear. To those who come after me and read this, well, history will be my judge. I bore the fear of multitudes in silence and fought the darkness as best as I knew how. I can say that without hesitation, but I wish I'd done better by that child. So, very interesting, we could call it speech, reflections put into the mouth of Morgan. Talking more about Morgan, we get a really interesting question at the 2009 independence signing, which is going to lead us into talking about a virtual God. If the White Council is so oblivious to things going on in the mortal world, how is it that Morgan knew exactly when the nuclear test was going to be for when he nuked the Skinwalker? And Dresden says, well, a couple of tests had happened, and those things are disruptive. They send out a giant electromagnetic pulse, so naturally the wizards noticed it. They did some research to figure out what it was. Once they understood, they made sure to know each time it was going to happen so nobody would get freaked out. So Morgan just had to plan it to lure the Skinwalker onto the range at the right time. Then he opened up a portal to the Never Never and barred the door behind himself. Boom! Senior wizards are actually fairly aware of big things going on with mortals. They knew all about what was happening in the U.S. and Russia during the Cold War. In fact, they were the ones who realized Russia really wasn't a major power, and everything they were doing was in fear of the U.S. and in preparation for defending themselves. Wizards planted the idea for the U.S. to bug Russia. When the U.S. found out that Russia really was just scared of them, that's when the peace discussions began. Now, we get a person called Logan Phoenix who writes to Butcher and says, in mythology, a skinwalker is a human who can take animal shape. And here's where we get going back to that theme of, well, what we're getting isn't always the full story. So Butcher says, yes, in mainstream Western academic mythology, which was mostly established at a time when everyone automatically assumed the Native Americans couldn't possibly have had anything original in their mythos. And yes, a skinwalker is the same thing as a European Gothic witch werewolf. But I'd advise anyone to at least read something that was written by someone who talked to a Native American at some point, preferably one of the Diné. Though it is not a matter of open discussion among the tribes even today. They aren't the same. They share some similar capabilities, but they're not at all the same. And then we get a another discussion going on. Don brings up, according to another thread I read last night, an online thread, my hunch about Mr. Farrow hiring Shag Nasty appears to be incorrect. Shag Nasty is, of course, the name for the skinwalker that Dresden coins. So, there's a WOJ stating that the person, thing, organization that hired him has been talked about, but we haven't seen her, him, it, them on stage. The quote didn't provide a date, but, it was obviously after TC, right? Turncoat, and before Ghost Story. So, here's what Dresden says. Actually, my original statement in this thread has been wildly misinterpreted. Shag Nasty and his ilk don't minion for anyone, is what I said. At least not since they stopped minioning for the holy people. Now, they do trade favors. That can look a lot like minioning, but something like Shag Nasty has no use whatsoever for paltry things like money or physical goods or slaves or magical gadgets or tech or human influence. That stuff it would regard as insulting if it was offered. The real currency is favors, and it had a mission while it was on stage in Turncoat. But honestly, just hurting the people who are trying to protect and aid Morgan was more than enough motivation for it to be there. See, the flip side to the major currency being favors is there's also an enormous trade in grudges. And something like the Naglioshi doesn't just carry a grudge, it cherishes it. It feeds it before it cares for its own progeny and breeds it with other grudges to produce newer, stronger, more deeply malicious grudgelings. Yes, Shaggy was there at the behest of someone else, but mostly Shaggy was there because it was an awesome way to torment more than merely mortals who couldn't just smack his ass down like the folks at home. It didn't flee because it was afraid it would lose. It fled because it couldn't easily win. That's an important distinction. Most predators tend to take the sure thing whenever they can. Why gamble on taking a beating when you have infinite time to come back and kill someone properly with lots and lots of foreplay? We read about another monster who comes up in Changes, the Ick. Where did the Ick come from? I needed a monster to fit that outline, and then I looked up enough old Mayan words to find the word for dark and the word for eater, and Ik was dark and Vox was eater. I just put together from that, Oax rather, Ikuox, the heartbeat getting louder thing. I'm sure I read that in a game book somewhere. It might have been Chill, had a monster that way, and I really loved it. You could hear its heart beating so loud, you could hear it getting close. So I kind of put it together on the fly, that one. Like, I need a monster who does this and is like that. Okay, all right, now quick, go find a good excuse for what to name it, and then figure out how to pronounce it, and then forget how to pronounce it because Dresden's just going to call it the Ick. Now, we're going to move into another really important topic that we've already touched on a little bit. So Butcher has mentioned that free will is an important theme in these works. So we get a question coming from McNally's Pub by email. No free will ever, or no free will to disobey when commanded? I don't know it's possible to have intellect without will. Well, then again, most of us had to make decisions about what is true and what isn't, or what to remember, and this is talking about Bob. But a spirit of intellect is mostly just a talking library, a storehouse, although Bob also seems to understand what he knows. And so Butcher says, I don't want to hand out too much outside the context of an actual story, but within the context of the Dresden books, Bob isn't like an actual mortal person. Mortals are the ones who have free will, the ability to choose what they're doing, to choose between right and wrong. Without getting too thickly into the underlying philosophy, that's the thing that separates, for example, mankind from the angels. The angels didn't get the same kind of choice about their existence and what they would do with it. Mortals get the chance to make all kinds of decisions and can change their mind well at will. Other creatures, though they may look like people, don't get the same range of choices about who and what they will be. Mab, for example, is Mab. She can't show up and suddenly be merciful, generous, patient, and kind. It would never so much as occur to her to do so because it isn't a fundamental part of her nature, and she can't choose to change it. She simply isn't capable. She doesn't have free will in the same way that people do. It's related to the difference between having a soul and not having a soul as well. Without a soul, you aren't free to choose how you will shape that soul. You just stay what you are. But that's getting way off the subject of Bob. I mean, don't you think if he had totally free will, he'd be out of the skull all the time, hitching rides in people's heads on their way to strip bars or something? There's a reason he obeys Harry, and it's not purely because Harry offers him shelter from a gruesome demise. It's part of who and what he is. He's asked another question there. Does Bob know everything all the time? Or does he just know when he's asked a question? Can he ask himself questions? Wouldn't that involve will? And Butcher says he doesn't know everything. He knows a lot. There's a difference. He's been alive for centuries and worked with a lot of different wizards. And he remembers absolutely everything he's exposed to. He's an enormous source of information and practical experience, not a conduit to infinite knowledge. He's got limits. He can ask himself questions and attempt to extrapolate answers based upon what he knows or by asking other spirits for answers or venturing out and seeking getting more of it. That's what he is. He's innocent, more or less, of the whole question of good and evil. His existence is focused on questions and answers, upon simply acquiring the knowledge, and that's that, which is not to say he could never become anything more, especially, now notice what he's saying here, especially if he hangs out with mortals a lot. Mortals, in their own possession of free will, have a tendency to influence beings who don't have it in one way or another. I suppose it's entirely possible, for example, that too much association with mortals is what changed Aurora, former summer lady, and gave her a determination to destroy the natural order in an effort to change its very nature. For the better, true, but it would have never occurred to any of the other queens, mothers, or lady that such a thing might be until it had already happened. It's not in their nature. But maybe I've said too much. At MarsCon, he's asked, again, could you explain free will from Bob's perspective? And Butcher says, free will from Bob's perspective? Bob thinks free will is a complete illusion because he doesn't have it. It's a conceit that mortals have to make for themselves feel like they can be in control of things. Really, but it doesn't actually exist. That's Bob's take on it. But then again, Bob doesn't have free will. He's sort of. Cherryh says in these questions, he said that Lash, so the reflection or the shadow of the demoness associated with the denarius that is in Dresden's, not just his head, his soul, but actually taking up residence in his brain, who's going to sacrifice herself, by the way, for Dresden of her own free will. So Bob says that Lash got it, Jim and Butcher says, Lash isn't Bob. And then the answer is, well, no, but he said that Lash God obtained free will. Yeah, Bob doesn't have to tell the truth to Dresden. I mean, come on. Bob offered it as a possible explanation, but you know, Bob's essentially, he's a theoretician. That's what he does. Explain this? Okay, maybe it was this. I don't know. But yeah, he tries to stay out of the whole anything that verges on mortality or morality. Bob tries to avoid speaking with any authority on because he doesn't have any compass himself. It depends on who happens to be in possession of the skull at the time. Now later, in 2001, in the Bitten by Books Q&A, we get this question. Lash was apparently able to gain free will from Harry, a mortal. Can mortals potentially grant free will to other supernaturals like vampires and fairies? Here's what Dresden says. That's a spectacularly complicated question, really. Lash didn't gain free will per se. Lash gained individuality, became a singular entity, self-motivated and distinct from the personality of Laskiel the Fallen. That personality was strongly influenced by Dresden, who believes very strongly in individual choice and responsibility, but doesn't necessarily equate to free will in the sense of what mortals possess. You might note that Lash essentially committed suicide with her free will, a choice which rather strongly resembles another choice a few books later in the series. So we don't get a full resolution about free will, but the picture's pretty complicated, isn't it? Fantasy literature interview is where we're going to end with this little portion. And I think this is really quite a great question and response. A topic that's garnered a lot of discussion recently is the relationship between authors and fans. Do you think you have responsibilities to your fans? So here's what Butcher says. Frankly, I don't have any responsibility to the fans beyond writing a book. They in turn don't have any responsibility to me other than acquiring the book legitimately. Of course, I also think it's professionally and personally stupid to leave the writer-fan relationship at that. It's smart for me to produce books in a timely and regular fashion, just like it's smart for me to provide the means of getting a book autographed. It's smart for me to appear in public occasionally and get to actually meet the readers face-to-face and to be as friendly and courteous as I can when I do. It's smart for me to tell a fun and satisfying tale. It's even smart for me to talk with fans about the story so far and to hear their opinions on various characters and story events. And I try to do all that whenever I can. Now here's where it turns. It's no longer just prudential. To me, a fan/writer relationship isn't about obligation, about who owes what to whom. It's about giving, and it's about pride. I try to give the readers my best effort with everything I write, and every time I finish a project, I want it to be something of which I can feel proud. But to any fans reading this, don't worry, I don't expect anything from you guys beyond acquiring the book legitimately. I'm low maintenance. So, what a great capping to that. So we've learned a lot, I think, in looking at these various interviews, emails, Reddit threads, and other places where Butcher has revealed a bit of his thought process and sentiments about some pretty important philosophical matters, what the series is really about, free will, who's got it, who doesn't, why, and a host of other things as well. I could go on all day about this series, but we do have to wrap it up, and so I wanted to do so by bringing a few passages in that tell us a little bit more about Dresden and his own sort of backstory and where perhaps the series is going to go. So first, Laskiel is going to tell him that he is somebody who actually has power over outsiders. Now, these are beings that were all but immune to magic, and she says, there was a complex confluence of events, of energies, of circumstances that would have given a child born under them the potential to wield that power. As it turns out, Dresden has done that when he was 16 years old. And Dresden says, wait a second, the only victory I had over a spiritual entity when I was that young was when my old master had sent an assassin demon after me. It hadn't turned out the way Du Morne had been hoping. Laskiel leaned closer. He who walks behind is an outsider. Harry, a terrible creature, the most potent of the walkers, a powerful knight among their ruling entities. But when he came for you, you overthrew him. So we're getting a little bit of the chosen one trope here, which we also get, for example, when Harry is confronting Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is like, "You're really a guy I could work with." We also get a really interesting thing coming up here in Changes with Vaderung, who is Odin, right? And Odin says to Harry, everything's connected, the whole game, and you're only beginning to learn who the players are. And then he says, they say you can know a man by his enemies, Dresden. You defy beings that should cow you into silence. You resist forces that are inevitable for no more reason than you believe they should be resisted. You bow your head to neither demons nor angels, and you put yourself in harm's way to defend those who cannot defend themselves. I think I like you. right? So that's a really interesting reflection from a god who, in just a few moments, will show Cherryh what a god is indeed capable of. Now, speaking of that, and coming back to Turncoat, Anastasia Lucio is going to tell Cherryh about his mother. And she's going to say all the wardens knew her. And Cherryh says she was a warden. Anastasia says, no, she was considered a threat to the laws of magic. What does that mean? It means she made it a point to dance as close to the edge of breaking the laws as she possibly could whenever she got the chance. It took her all of a year after she was admitted to the council to start agitating for change. I had to focus on the road. What kind of change? She was furious that the laws of magic have nothing to do with right and wrong. She pointed out how wizards could use their abilities to bilk people out of their money, to intimidate and manipulate them, to steal wealth and property from others or destroy it outright. And so long as the laws were obeyed, the council would do nothing whatsoever to stop them or discourage others from following their example. She wanted to reform the council's laws to embrace concepts of justice, as well as limiting the specific use of magic. I frowned. Wow, what a monster. She exhaled slowly. Can you imagine what would happen if she'd had her way? Once a body of laws describing justice was applied to the council, it would be a short step to using that body to involve the council in events happening in the outside world. Gosh, yeah, I said, you're right. A bunch of wizards trying to effect good in the world would be awful. Who's good? Anastasia said calmly. No one is an unjust villain in his own mind, Cherryh, perhaps even especially those who are the worst of us. Some of the cruelest tyrants in history are motivated by noble ideas or made choices they would call hard but necessary steps for the good of their nation. We're all the hero of our own story, right? So, Harry's a lot like his mom in important respects as well. And I want to finish up with a little reference here to something that we've already talked about a bit. So we find out that, the Blackstaff, Ebenezer, is indeed Harry's grandfather. And we read this. And suddenly it made sense why he would barely ever speak of his apprentice Margaret Le Fay, a name she'd earned for herself when her birth certificate must have read Margaret McCoy. Hell, for that matter, he'd probably never told the council Margaret was his daughter. I sure as hell had no intentions of letting them know about Maggie if I got out of this mess. My mother had been eventually killed by enemies she'd made, and Ebenezer, her father, the most dangerous man on the White Council, had not been there to save her. The circumstances wouldn't matter, no matter what he'd accomplished. I knew the old man would never forgive himself for not saving his daughter's life any more than I would if I'd failed Maggie. It explained why he had changed the Grey Council's focus and led them here. He had to try to save me and to save my little girl, and some cynical portion of me added himself. I wasn't sure that would be a conscious thought on his part underneath the mountain of issues he had accrued. Right? So, very important reflections there. And we get to see a lot about Dresden's character. Now, as I mentioned, by the end of this, he's dead, and we don't know what that actually means for him, but this is a great place to end this discussion of a really wonderful and getting richer and richer series of the Dresden Files novels.